This segment is brought to you by JigMasters Jigs. When in doubt, get the jig out. Go to JigMasters.com and use promo code PNF20 and save 20% off your next jig order today.
Welcome to the Paddle and Fin Podcast, the Bass Fishing for Noobs segment, where we try to improve our skills as an angler by learning new techniques or improving the ones we already know. I'm your host, Ryan Milford. Welcome back to the Paddle and Fin Podcast. This is the Bass Fishing for Noobs segment. I'm Ryan. Got my co-host here, Sean. How you doing tonight, Sean?
I'm doing all right.
Before we get into this, I did want to say that, last week or the week before, so one of those episodes, we talked about, maybe putting together a noob kayak online tournament. And we got some good response out of that, and I think the other guys here at Paddle and Fin really liked that idea. So I believe we're going to run with it. Now, I believe Brian wants to push it off till May to give us time to get everything, right. So, we're not rushing, trying to get it done by April. But, yeah, I think it's going to be really cool. We're still putting together all the rules and prizes and all that stuff. So stay tuned for all that. But just want to give y'all a heads up that I believe this is going to happen. But, yeah, tonight our guest, we got Mr. Steve Coomer from Ohio here. How you doing tonight, Steve?
Okay, doing good. Glad to be here, guys.
It's awesome to have you on the show, man.
I want you tell it.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
I want you to tell everybody a little bit about yourself and your history with fishing and all that good stuff.
Okay. What I usually tell people, like in my fishing seminars and stuff, and things like that, is just I'm basically just an old hillbilly that fishes a couple hundred days a year, and I river fish. I'm pretty much exclusively river fish. I'll always tell everybody, don't ask me about how to fish in a lake, but if you want to know something about smallmouth bass fishing in the river, I think I've done that about as much as anybody on earth. Probably too much if you ask my wife. But, that's just kind of what I'm a fanatic about. I kind of specialize in just trying to catch a big fish. I really don't fish tournaments because of that. I mean, I'm just more. If I tell you about what a fishing trip from the day before, I don't usually say, the guys that follow me online, I don't say, well, I caught 17. Instead, I say, well, I caught one that was 19.5 inches long. That's just kind of what I'm after, is trying to catch a good one, I guess, at this point in my life. But that's what I do.
That's awesome. I know, catching several small fish is cool, but man, there's just something about the adrenaline whenever you hang into a big fish. Like I remember when I caught my personal best, my hands were shaking for 20, 30 minutes afterwards and all that. So yeah, I think it'd be cool to, talk about, how to target specifically the larger smallmouth fish in the river.
I feel like at least in the rivers and streams that I fish, that they act completely different than smallmouth bass. That they're inhabiting a different part of the river. That small bass. You go to any riffle in the spring and you throw something flashy or a spinnerbait, you're going to catch some smallmouth bass. But you could do that for a lifetime and maybe not catch a 20-inch smallmouth bass out of a smaller river or stream, unless you're on the Susquehanna or the Canoe or something. But on an average smallmouth stream, you're just not going to do it. But that's because I really believe they act different. They inhabit a different part of the river. They're just different fish. Um, I I think it almost goes into biology if you don't mind hearing my 5 minute spiel on why I think big fish are different.
No, we want to hear it.
Yep.
The you know you know a I think there's a reason that all those small bass are up on the riffles and that 20-inch bass isn't. So I'm old enough to remember, before everything was digital and online, and you had a radio or your TV was an antenna on the roof, and the bigger the antenna was, the better the reception. And I think a big smallmouth bass, that lateral line makes all the difference in the world on where he stays in the river. That he wants to maximize his advantage. And everything in nature, it does what it does for a reason. It's not random like sometimes people act like. And a smallmouth bass, he's 10 inches long and his lateral line 7 or 8 inches long. He just can't operate as efficiently in like really swift, turbulent water and see through that nearly as well as a big smallmouth bass. And I think a big smallmouth bass is in swifter, stronger, more turbulent water most of the time. He's not up there in that glide right below the ripple. He's usually on a really strong seam between the fastest water in the river and some slack water that he can set in and ambush stuff that's coming along. And you need to just fish him a little bit different than you do the smaller smallmouth bass. It's amazing to me. I've read a lot of studies. I'm really into like studies on bass, and that there's several university studies that say that a fish's lateral line is actually more important to its feeding than its eyesight. That they've taken some fish and they've disabled its lateral line, and then they've taken some other fish that they blinded, and they put them in crystal clear water, and so this fish that's lateral line wasn't working right, but it could see perfectly fine in that crystal clear water, actually had a harder time feeding than the fish that was blind, but its lateral line worked. And that to me makes all the difference in the world in targeting a big fish. You're trying to target a fish that his lateral line is 2 or 3 inches longer. 2 or 3 times longer than small bass, and so he's gonna use that to his advantage, and he's gonna be in a completely different part of the river. Most of the year, I think for a big bass, there's really no place that is too fast, as long as there's just a little pocket for that bass to lay in. If it's so fast that you think, damn, I'm going to drown if I get into that stuff, that's the place I try to catch a big smallmouth bass most of the summer.
That definitely presents some challenges in presenting bait to them, I'm sure, but I'm sure you can elaborate on that a little.
It really does. I think for a bigger fish for me hunting the bigger fish, my lure selection is way more limited than when I am just out trying to catch, I'm just out trying to catch some bass. If I'm trying to catch a trophy smallmouth bass out of a river, in that super fast turbulent water, and I'm trying to fish that little pocket behind a rock or up against a wall, you throw a crankbait into that water that it's that fast, it's going to flip up on its side. Spinnerbait's not going to work right. It's going to roll over. Usually, it's pretty well exclusively something on a big hunk lead. It's a lead-headed jig and a swim bait most of the time for me, or a grub.
Now we're talking.
Trying to catch a big fish. I'm not saying, yeah. I'm not saying for just going and know I'm going to catch 20 fish, well then I would approach that completely differently. But for a big fish, I'm really comfortable most of the year throwing a soft plastic and then matching the size of the lead head to how fast the current is. And I usually always have in the kayak or on my pack something of a huge variety of weights, and some of them would seem ridiculous. It's like there might be, it's 5 miles of river that you'd look like a fool if you're throwing anything but an 1/8 ounce jig head because it's 2 foot deep and it's a small stream. And then there's that one little pocket where maybe there's a bridge abutment or something that shunts all the current to one side and it's blazing fast. And in that one 10-foot spot, I might throw a 1/2 ounce jig head, but it's the only spot in the whole stream that you wouldn't look like a fool throwing it. But it pays to have some stuff like that in your kayak, or in your pack if you're wading.
Now, quick question for me. I recently caught my first fish off of a soft plastic swim bait, and now I'm kind of like, man, I really want to learn. I really want to get more into the swim baits because it's pretty cool. So when you're throwing a swim bait, what are you throwing, like a Kayak like everybody else is? And like what size swim bait are you talking here?
Oh, this is going to get complicated, but it is really interesting, I think. Up here in Ohio, the EPA shocks every stream. Actually, I think they shock every stream in the eastern United States at about a 3-mile interval. And they electroshock and sample everything in that stream. Now, I know in Ohio it's posted online. If you go to the Ohio EPA site and you enter any stream, it'll give you the report and it'll tell you what the electroshocked out of the stream. And I think it does that for every state in the country, but you're probably going to have to, you may not be able to find it online without contacting your local EPA. But up here anyway, every stream that I fish, you can go online and it'll say, on the Little Miami River, 1.5 miles below Route 4, we electroshocked up this many spot fin shiners and this many central stone rollers and this many, shad. And you can actually match your swim bait size and your color to what is in your river, and you can make a specific lure selection for where you fish. It's pretty cool, but it definitely takes some research. I'm not sure that in every state you can do that without having to call the EPA or call the Department of Natural Resources. There's a wildlife biologist in charge of the electroshocking program, I think, in every Department of Natural Resource, and those guys I have found are really good about answering questions, and they'll send you and email you their shocking data from every state that I've tried so far. So that's kind of the way I go about it. I try to match the size and the shape of the bait and the color to what I think is in that section of the river. There's some general rules if you don't want to do that. In almost most of our streams, you fish a lake and it's got shad and it's got crayfish and it's got couple shiners, and then that's about it. That's what the smallmouth are going to eat. In most streams in the eastern United States, there will be at least 7 or 8 different darters. There'll be 7 or 8, 10 different kinds of shiners. There'll be 8 or 10 different kinds of minnows. There's a big selection of stuff, and each of those fills a little niche, but they follow a general rule. In the pools, it's usually something like a chub or a shiner. It's something that's flat in profile, and it's lighter in color. And the closer you get to the ripples, there's stuff like darters, and there's that's the kind of things that live in the riffles. They're usually rounder in profile, and they're darker, or they're a little more colorful. They got reds and blues on them. The river that I fish the most, 28% of all the fish in the river are a darter species. And darter species look nothing like what we conventionally think of as a minnow. We think of a minnow as silvery and flat, and darters are round, and they're brown and gold colored with little flecks of blue. They look a lot like a grub shape instead of a flat minnow shape. So, but then so you kind of have to match. The closer you get to the riffle, I throw something that's rounder and darker, and the more I fish in the pool, I throw something that's flatter and lighter in color, just to follow and try to be a little more natural.
Okay.
It's completely different than lake fishing, I think.
Are there like specific brands you usually tend to gravitate towards with those, or is it all still based on that?
Ohio, up here in Ohio, my brother has a popular line of lures, and they're big Coomer lures, and so I usually use his stuff. He makes a 3-inch grub, and then he makes a flat. It's called the curly shad. That's kind of shad shaped, and he makes a swim bait. It's a lot like I think you could use. Most 3-inch grubs to me work fine. I'd be happy with most 3-inch grubs up close to the riffle, and then a good quality flat swim bait probably in the pool.
Awesome. You said it's Coomer Lures is his company?
Yes. Yeah.
I might have to check that out.
That's what I throw most of the time. It's pretty much a Ohio, Indiana based lure company. I'm not sure you're going to have a hard time finding it outside of that circle.
I'll have to get my connections in Ohio and Indiana to hook me up then.
Yeah, there you go. Mr. Brad Hicks can get you some.
There you go.
The only other lure that I consistently use if I'm just after a trophy, and I'm a big fan of saying I don't know why, I don't know when I don't know, but for some reason, at least in the streams that I fish, a big buzzbait triggers big smallmouth bass. I think you can throw a big buzzbait and you may not catch a lot of fish, but if you can catch, at least here in the streams I fish, if you can catch 30 of them, a couple of them will be a trophy smallmouth bass. Just throwing a big full size, what you would consider a largemouth bass buzzbait instead of the little 3-inch long buzzbait that everybody thinks is a smallmouth buzzbait. I usually throw a big one. It's funny. I've read some studies, and smallmouth bass, if they are eating a minnow, they are not selective to size, and it's just as much trouble to catch a little minnow as it is to catch a 4 or 5-inch minnow. And the smallmouth bass doesn't care about the size of the minnow he eats. It's different when it comes to crayfish. The bigger the smallmouth bass is, there's been 3 or 4 studies that show the bigger the smallmouth bass is, the more selective he is on the size of the crayfish that he eats. I think it was the University of Wisconsin that they built a big giant, like 300-gallon aquarium, and they put these smallmouth bass in it, and then they would dump crayfish in there. And the 10 or 12-inch smallmouth bass would run over to the first crawdad he seen. He didn't care if it was 3 inches long or 1.5 inches long or 4 inches long, and he would do just like we all see on YouTube, he would suck it in and blow it out, and suck it in and blow it out, and fight with it a little bit till he gets a claw off. And it might take him 30 or 40 seconds before he ate it, but he would eat that, whichever crawfish he come to. And then they had some 19-inch smallmouth bass. And the 19-inch smallmouth bass, if there were only big 3 and 4 inch long crayfish available, they might be a week before they ate. They would just be starving before they would go over and eat a big crawfish. I don't know if they're older and just more experienced and know that, if that big old craw gets a hold of me, he's going to hurt me. But then those same smallmouth bass, those same 19 inchers, they would throw little crawls in the aquarium, and like an 1.5 inch long crawl, the smallmouth bass would just swim right over to it and suck it in, wouldn't blow it back out, just suck it in, eat it, and go to the next one, suck it in, eat it. And if you throw what everybody thinks is a big, the big pretty plastic crayfish with the big claws, you're selecting to catch a smaller smallmouth bass, in my opinion, than if you throw a smaller crayfish. I think we all use crayfish imitations that are too big, and we use minnow imitations that are too small most of the time. That's kind of my opinion for catching a trophy. I'm not talking about catching numbers, but you're selecting to catch a smaller smallmouth bass if you throw a big crayfish. My disclaimer is that I don't know nothing about largemouth bass fishing in lakes. That may be the greatest thing ever to flip, up in the trees to catch a 5-pound largemouth. But if you're trying to catch a 5-pound smallmouth, you're better off with about 1.5 inch long crayfish imitation.
Well, I will say that using I'd say a bigger size crawl, I have caught a over 5-pound largemouth. But you may have just sold me on something. I've been thinking about getting those Z-Man Ned rig crawls, those little bitty crawls that they made for the Ned rigs. Mm-hmm. I've been thinking about picking some of those up, and that's what I thought about whenever you just mentioned that smaller crawl presentation. I might have to go pick some of those up and try that now when I go target some smallmouth.
I know Berkeley. I think it was Berkeley. Anyway, it was somebody for Pure Fishing. They did it was Berkeley. They did a study, and they had all these smallmouth bass in aquariums, and they presented them different crayfish imitations, and a big pretty crayfish imitation with legs and big claws. They recorded how many strikes they got, and then they modified it and put smaller claws on it, and it got more strikes, and they kept whittling down the claws and whittling down the legs, and the thing that got the most strikes was just a crayfish body with no legs and no claws and no arms. It was just that flat shape of a crayfish body that got the most strikes. But they didn't sell that, because while they're testing the fish, they're testing the fishermen. And all I wanted was the one with the big pretty giant claws that floated up and looked good in the water. And so they ended up selling the crayfish imitation that was the least effective on the fish, because it was the most effective on the fishermen. I'm a huge believer in that you need to downsize the size of your crayfish, especially for a big fish. You may catch just as many on a bigger crawl, but you're going to catch smaller ones than the guy that's fishing a little crawl. Now with minnows, I don't think they care. They just want whatever minnow they can eat. It takes a bass in a river. It takes him 10 or 12 years to get to be 19 or 20 inches long. And I don't know if he's just got enough experience to know that, hey, that big crawl, I don't know if you've ever seen the fish with crawls, but if a 4-incher gets a hold of you, you'll know it. And I don't know if the bass know that, or it's just an instinctive thing, but it's definitely, the bigger the bass, the more selective he is about the crayfish he eats.
That makes sense if you compare it to like humans. The older people get, the wiser they seem to be. Like, you know, being smarter about choices they make. So when you're young, you're down for anything. So yeah,
Yeah,
I can see that
yeah,
in bass.
yeah. I mean, it might be just as simple as that. I don't know, because the studies that I read definitely say that a 12 or 14-inch smallmouth bass doesn't care. He just tries to get whatever he can get.
That's like the late teenager bass right there, right?
Yeah, yeah. I guess he is. Yeah, he's just trying to get whatever he can get. Maybe you got a point there. I hadn't thought of it that way, but you're probably right. You're probably right.
Now you said, oh, go ahead.
My my grandpa. I come from, like I said, a long line of hillbillies, and my grandpa, we would seine crawls when I was a kid and fish with live crayfish, and he would always pinch the claws off, and he would say, "You're going to catch more fish, if you pinch the claws off," and it turns out that science, proves them good old boys right, that you are going to catch more fish, or at least you're going to catch bigger ones.
Now you had said you fish them on jig heads. Are you saying like just a ball head jig, or like a skirted jig, or what kind of jig heads are you using?
Most of the time, I'm a big fan of just a plain ball headed jig and a swim bait. I'm trying to throw it into something, I'm trying to throw it into that seam that's usually right up against a rock or right up against an abutment, and that way I mold my own. I go through so many in the summer that sometime in the winter I'll sit down and mold 1,000 of them, and that way, you're out a quarter instead of you're out of a $16, suspending crankbait, and you'll throw it into places that you wouldn't throw that crankbait, and in that really fast, swift water, it's more effective anyway. I think if you fish streams that have a more of a crayfish population, you probably might be better off throwing a skirted jig more. I live in farm country. The bottom of our pools are pretty silty and they're pretty soft. And honestly, I'm imitating the bait fish more than I'm imitating a crayfish most of the time, because we just don't have the big populations of crayfish that streams in West Virginia or Tennessee or somewhere that aren't in such heavily farmed places have. Just because of the composition of the bottom of our rivers here in Ohio, Indiana, and northern Kentucky. The actual bottom composition of the river, I think, means a lot.
So you said the bottoms of yours are more soft. So if you got like a lot of rock, would you consider more of a crayfish presentation then?
Yeah, I think so. I would. It might go back to ideally you're gonna talk to your Department of Natural Resources and see what's in your stream the most. And a lot of the tributaries to our rivers up here are loaded with crayfish, and then I'll fish more of a skirted jig, or I'll fish a small plastic crayfish, but most of the rivers, at least here in Ohio, we're running through farm country, and we just do not have as much of a population of crayfish. It probably makes our smallmouth bass a little easier to find because they are closer to the riffles and they're closer to, you can weed out a lot of the river because it's got a soft bottom, and everybody knows smallmouth, they like current and a hard bottom. So but I do think that if you live in farm country, you should consider throwing more of a minnow bait than a crayfish bait, even though Every magazine tells you, smallmouth bass eat crayfish, smallmouth bass eat crayfish. They do in classic magazine smallmouth rivers. If you're fishing the Canoe or the Susquehanna or Big South Fork of the Cumberland or something, but up here in farm country, I think you're better off throwing a minnow most of the time.
I was going to ask you a little bit about how you approach these spots. So if you're in your kayak and you want to be in that fast-moving water or casting into it anyway, are you floating down and then anchoring right below it and casting up into it, or are you just floating the whole way and hitting what you can?
Yeah, I'll either anchor across from it or beach it, across from it. Most of the time you're going to throw slightly upstream and across and let that soft plastic flow with the seam so that it looks natural coming to that fish that's in that little pocket. While we're talking about that, I think I could throw something out there that is a tremendous big fish spot that I have not really heard touted a lot, and that is that in a lot of rivers and streams, there's a lot of like bridge abutments or lead into under roads where there's like a 30-foot long smooth concrete wall, and if that is in really fast current, that will sometimes produce a trophy smallmouth bass. We look at those spots and we think, man, there's nothing on that wall to hold a bass. It's just a smooth wall. And like there's one up here that I've caught 3 20-inch smallmouth bass off of this one flat wall that is about 35 feet long, and it doesn't have a single feature on it, but it has really fast current. And the current is running lengthwise down the wall. And what happens is that current, as it's going down that smooth wall, it's rubbing against that wall, and it starts dragging as it's going down the wall. And somewhere down that wall, you'll see that the faster current is getting ahead of that current that lags, and it'll break free from that wall, and it'll make a little strip of turbulence right along the wall about 5 inches wide, and it'll be down the remaining length of the wall, and there's just enough room for a smallmouth bass to tuck himself in against that wall. And again, it's a big fish spot. We were talking about their lateral line being longer. If the water's fast enough and turbulent enough, that is like tailor-made for a trophy smallmouth bass. He can set in that little pocket of water that's caused by the water dragging against that wall, and he can use that big lateral line, and he can see stuff coming in that fast water, and it can't see him because a minnow's got an inch long lateral line, and he's got a big advantage there. And that is an overlooked spot that I never hear anybody talk about in rivers and streams, that because it's a one fish spot, there's only room for just that one fish to tuck himself up against the wall. But if you can find one of those in your creek or your river, it's consistently year after year after year, you're going to catch a trophy smallmouth bass off of it. Every time you see a bridge abutment, or a guy will build a concrete wall at the end of his property so that the river doesn't wash away his front yard, check those out. And if there's enough current on them, sometimes those are like a top secret trophy smallmouth spot. It's worth looking out for.
Man, I just thought of like 3 or 4 different spots like that. And I'm like, I'm gonna have to hit those.
Yeah. You have to go over and look at them and see if if there's enough current to make that drag. But man, it is amazing. It's kind of overlooked because you're never going to go there and catch 6 fish, or you're never going to go there and catch 8 fish. But you might go and catch the fish. That's
sometimes that's all you need.
And yeah, Yeah, that's all I care about. That's all you need. It's just the fish. And check those out. It'll surprise you.
Definitely gonna
You
try
know,
that
you're
out.
really all you're looking for is a spot the size of a shoebox. You know that's got just enough room for that big smallmouth bass to tuck himself in there out of that current, and then he's got an advantage. And I honestly think that's why we don't catch more trophy smallmouth bass than we do, because everybody fishes for them like they're fishing to catch 20. And if you're fishing to catch 20, you're not going to catch a 20 incher. You got to look at them differently.
I can already see Brad Hicks right now when he listens to this episode. You know, he keeps talking about he's still trying to get that 20 incher in Ohio. You know, I don't think he's broke that 20 inch mark now, and he's gonna be like, I've been doing it all wrong this whole time. It, you might have just
It's a rough thing to do in Ohio. The state of Ohio, they give out a Fish Ohio award, and you get a little pin, and it used to be that it was for a 20-inch smallmouth bass, and they would only give out like a couple hundred out of the whole state every year. There just wasn't very many turned in. But if you quit fishing for numbers and just try to fish these spots for that one fish, you can do it every year. You can catch 3 or 4 every year, and that's saying a lot for Ohio.
Yeah, and you mentioned the pins that y'all get. I think that's really cool. Here in Tennessee, we got the uh, reward program or whatever you want to call it here too. You get like a certificate, but I think that pin idea is cool. Like put it in a hat or something like that. So, yeah, I wish Tennessee
Yeah,
would
there's
adapt
guys
that.
that are crazy about those. You'll see the whole hat cover. Yeah, I think it's a neat program. I I, I think it's a pretty cool program. Um, they switched it now out of an inland river or stream. It's an 18-inch smallmouth bass, so that they would get more participation. It was just too hard to catch a 20.
Yeah.
But we're just not quite Tennessee or West Virginia or Virginia, I guess.
Sean, do you know, are you aware if y'all have something like that in Pennsylvania?
I believe they do. Yeah, I am fairly certain they do. So now you talk about the Susquehanna. I live about 15 minutes from the Susquehanna, and we have close to where I live is a mile wide bridge, 2 bridges actually. So there's probably 20 or 30 of those bridge pilings. I'm definitely going to have to check those out a little closer because there's definitely some current moving through there and some pretty big bridge pilings. So
Yeah, they're worth looking at. And the nice part about it is it's a piece of structure that never changes. You know how you go back to the river and everything looks rearranged from the year before, from floods and all that kind of stuff. Those are there. You find one, and it's a lot. You may have to look at 50 of them to find 2 that'll work for you. But if you find one, it's going to work for you for decades. That's the cool part about it. I should mention one more thing that I think would really help out the guys in more farm country, in the guys in Indiana and Illinois and Ohio and places like that. I'm I'm pretty well known around here for I do a lot of writing about the experiences of trip and nature and seeing an eagle, and I'm really into that, and that's kind of what I'm known for. Probably my dirty little secret, if you want to call it, is that in farm country, the vast majority, of of the um, of the trophy smallmouth bass that I catch are on a piece of concrete. even though I'm looking at nature and looking at all that kind of stuff. That's in our farm country streams. You know, we don't, here in Ohio, we don't have very many streams. We don't have very many. You have to really look to find a rock that's bigger than a garbage can. There's a lot of rocks in the streams, but they're smaller rocks. We don't have the big rocks that are the size of a VW bus or a Volkswagen or something like that. So when the river floods and it's raging in the winter and spring, it moves all the rocks out of the really raging fastest part of the river. And you know, if you're in the Big South Fork of the Cumberland or something and there's a rock as big as your house, it'll be in that fastest water and nothing can move it. And so it creates that really great seam to grow a big trophy smallmouth bass, just like I was talking about. He can sit there and the whole river's rushing around this big giant rock and it's really turbulent water, and that occurs naturally. Here in farm country, honestly, what creates that is concrete, and you've got a better chance to catch a trophy smallmouth bass fishing a little more unnatural stuff, because that's what's in the river that's big enough to survive and stay in place in the fastest current in the river. Most of our streams, you know, back in the day, I wrote a book about the Little Miami River, and it had, in the Little Miami and the tributaries that went into the Little Miami, all the different little tributaries that went into it, but there were about 200 and something low-head dams, and they're all gone, but the remnants of those low-head dams and big chunks of concrete and all that kind of stuff is still in the river. And every time, if you fish in farm country, every time you see a big chunk of concrete, you should check it out, because that's probably, if it's in enough current, that's probably the best spot within hundreds of yards either direction to catch a big smallmouth bass. It's certainly a much better spot than 100 yards up on the ripple, to be honest, because it's got deeper water, it's got faster water, it's got more current, it's got more food for the fish.
That makes a lot of sense.
Now, there's something, you know, I was thinking about earlier while you were talking. I wanted to ask you about this. Down here, you know, about 5 minutes away from me is Henry Horton State Park. The Duck River, you know, it's a smaller river, flows right through there. Well, right there at the park, there's a part where the river, it's pretty wide in this area, but it slims way down to where it's only like, you know, I'd say maybe 15 feet. You know, it's like probably less than, maybe half, but less than half of what the river usually is. It slims down right there, so it creates, you know, some riffles right there, some faster moving current, and it kind of goes down this slope, and then it opens back up again. And it's pretty shallow right there. I think it's like maybe a couple feet right there where it's coming down that slope. Well, right there where it opens up, I was wondering about that spot right there, just off of where that current is. You know, fishing, you know, just outside of that current. You know, I feel like fish are gonna sit right there and wait for food to come down through that current. Am I thinking right there?
Yeah, I would think so. I think one thing you have to consider, and you really have to consider this, is that, you know, it takes a minimum of about 10 years for a smallmouth bass to get to be really big, to get to be over 19 in a river or stream. You also have to consider how accessible that spot is. You know, if it's somewhere that somebody can just pull up and some redneck can throw that smallmouth bass in a 5-gallon bucket and take him home, he doesn't have 10 years to get to be a trophy. It's odd. Smallmouth bass, in a lake, smallmouth behave differently over their entire lifetime than a smallmouth in a stream. They're out in the main lake and they're chasing schools of shad and they're real nomadic and they follow the bait fish. In a smaller river or stream, biologists consider smallmouth bass to be a sedentary fish species, and what they mean by that is that after they leave from where they're going to spawn and they go to where they're going to spend the summer, they will spend their entire summer every year of their life in one section of stream, and they will never leave it. And the studies that I've seen say that smallmouth bass use a really strong, like a knee-deep, a ripple that goes all the way across the river that's really strong and just an obvious, this is the line across the river. The smallmouth bass use that as a kind of a boundary, and they will spend their entire life between two of those. And believe it or not, if you catch a smallmouth bass below a really strong across the stream ripple, and then you wade up 30 yards and you catch a smallmouth bass above that ripple, for all intents and purposes, they could be 10 miles apart instead of 30 yards because they never have any, they're two distinct, different populations of smallmouth bass. They will come together to spawn, and they will come together in the winter to where they're going to spend the winter, but in the summer they are faithful their entire lives to one section of stream if it's a small, conventional smallmouth stream. And so kind of your job in the catching a trophy is to find that really nice seam, but it's also to find a really nice seam that smallmouth bass can live there, can live in that section of river for 10 or 12 years and get to be a trophy. And I'm saying that because you said it was in the state park, and it sounded like it might be a little too accessible.
Well,
that's something that I think about for catching a big fish.
This particular spot, so you're getting me kind of excited because this particular spot, I don't think it's very accessible with fishing from the bank, which most people do there. I don't know if I've ever even seen anybody else fish off of a kayak from there other than like me and my buddy. Now that could be just from lack of going there. I've only went there 2 or 3 times in my kayak, so there may be more people out there that I just don't realize. But especially in that spot, because I think most people that put in here are gonna go upstream from the launch instead of going down to this particular area. But you got me interested in trying this out because I feel like somebody would have to have a really long cast in order to cast over to where this is at from the bank. So I might have to try that out.
Sure, and then they'll probably not get to doing that. They're probably casting across all that current. They're not going to get down, not going to get the right presentation to that fish that's tucked in, out of the current. Mm-hmm. It's probably worth looking at. I will say one thing about being inaccessible too. There's kind of 2 places that I catch a lot of big smallmouth bass, and those are one of those is the place that's out in the middle of nowhere that is just a gigantic pain in the ass to get to, and the other one is a lot of times it's right in the middle of little towns. If there's a ripple and you got a nice boundary and there's 3/4 of a mile in between, and there's a neighborhood there and everybody's house backs up to the stream and there's chain link fences, and you know what, sometimes having a whole bunch having a stream right in the middle of a neighborhood makes it inaccessible in a way, if you can see what I'm talking about, as opposed to a half a mile down. It looks like it's woods and there's not a lot of houses, but there's a parking lot and there's access, so something to think about. Those are the 2 places that are your best chances, honestly, is to get away from everything or get right in the middle of everything, but it's not really accessible to the bank fishing guy. Because I don't know any kayak fishermen that keep smallmouth bass. Do you? You know, I really don't.
Keeps them.
Most kayak fishers. Yeah, So, you're not worried about the guy floating down through that spot. To produce a trophy smallmouth bass. You're honestly, I'm going to sound bigoted here, but because I do a lot of wading and I do a lot of bank fishing, but it's the bank fishing guys that keep smallmouth bass. And so you have to look at places that's not that easy for those guys to get to. Your place is probably definitely worth checking out.
Yeah, if nothing else, paddle upriver, because I don't even know if there's really anything up that way, and it's definitely not bank accessible from what I can see. Yeah, I'm gonna definitely be hitting that area a little bit this year.
I think that's the thing that my smallmouth bass fishing more than anything was learning and realizing that they are in the small creeks and the streams that I like to fish, that they are home bodies, and that they are in trying to pick them apart and thinking of section of stream instead of, oh, I'm going to get in the river and I'm going to wade a mile and a half of it. You know what I mean? And yeah, that's a good way to catch a lot of fish. A big one, the better way to do it would be, oh, I'm going to hit here and fish for a half an hour, and then I'm going to float down and fish here and here, because these are the spots that have a better chance of producing a big fish. They may not even look as fishy, they may not produce as many fish, but they have the potential, because they're inaccessible, to produce a bigger fish.
Well, I got one more question for you before we start wrapping up. I don't know if Sean has anything else for you, but real quick, going for just the bigger fish, you said you might only catch one. How often do you get skunked? I'm just curious.
It probably depends on the time of year. You're the best fishing we have around here is in rivers and streams. You shouldn't get skunked when the weather's warm. I'm throwing a 3-inch grub. Something's going to bite it. You know what I mean? That's the nice part about fishing a river or a stream. You're liable to catch any of 6 or 7 different species of fish. I do fish all winter, and this time of year, you better get used to getting skunked. At least if you're not getting skunked, you're not fishing hard enough this time of year. Our water right now is it's warmed up a little bit. We're up to 41, I think. 2 days it was 41. It's been upper 30s, and that makes catching a smallmouth pretty hard sometimes. The Fish Ohio program, going back to that, last year I set a goal of catching a Fish Ohio smallmouth every week of the year on average. I didn't catch one every single week of the year, but I did catch like 60 something.
Wow.
Fish that would have qualified for the Fish Ohio program. So I did catch a little more than one a week if you averaged it out. But come this time of year, you better get used to getting skunked. There's no doubt about it.
I know the only other thing I was going to say was when I was reading your social media a little bit, just to kind of get to know you, I saw a couple of your posts where you talked about checking out the DNR and the EPA sites, and that really made me want to start digging in for the PA version of that. And I didn't have a ton of luck right away, but I definitely, I feel like if I just give them a call, maybe that might be the ticket. They can point me in the right direction. But that sounds like...
I called Ohio's, and the guy sent me just a ton of neat information. He was happy to send me a lot of information, and I've done that for Ohio, and I've done that for Indiana, and both of the Department of Natural Resources really helped me out a lot. But for Ohio, and I don't know, you might want to check on it where you live. The real gold was with the EPA. The EPA just had so much information. It was incredible how much they had. And they broke down each stream into like 2 or 3 different mile-long sections instead of, oh, this is what the river's got. It's like, oh, this is what this piece of the river's got, and this is what this piece of the river's got. You can use the EPA stuff, and you can make a lure selection for your river that you fish, because most guys fish the same piece of river all the time. You can make the best one in the world for your piece of river if you can get the EPA information.
That makes a lot of sense. How often do they change that information, or is it pretty, like, if one section, is it going to stay that way with the same amount of fish for a long period of time, or?
There's several of them that I've seen that over like they usually do it. It seems like up here they're doing each river system at about a 4 or 5 year interval, and there's some stuff online that is, they've got maybe 3 or 4 of those, so there's 15 or 20 years worth of stuff, and it's pretty faithful, and unless there's some drastic development or some drastic rearranging, it seems pretty faithful to, if spot fin shiners are the most common thing, then they have been 5 years later, they still are. It seems like that. And it's certainly better than just blind guessing.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to have to look into that for the Duck River, that river I was talking about that's right up the road from me, because it's supposed to be one of the most, what's the technical term? I believe it's biodiverse rivers in the world. It's supposed to have, some, like one of the biggest, maybe not the most, as far as like quantity, but the most different types of species in it.
Diverse.
Yeah. So there's no telling what they're eating on there.
And I live, it's about 15 minutes one way, and I live and I can fish the Little Miami River watershed. And then about 15 minutes the other way is the Great Miami watershed. 2 rivers parallel each other through the state, and you would think they would have comparable minnow species in them. And like the Great Miami, the most common bait fish is a spot fin shiner, and then Little Miami stone roller, and they look absolutely nothing alike. And it is consistently, every stream is a little bit different than every other stream, and every piece of the stream is a little bit different. It's really worth a person's time if they fish the same piece of river all the time. I think it's really worth the time to do some digging and find out what's there. If you can't get online, well then, it's a lot of fun in the summer to just get a pair of gym shoes and a seine and get out there and see what's in there. I did some work for a conservancy and we had a program where we would take kids out and seine the river, and it was called What's in the River, and me and a bunch of kids would go out with seines, and we would sample sections of stream, and it was amazing how diverse the river is, and it's a lot of fun. If you can't find it online, I think you're, in the long run, you're better off spending a weekend seining the stream and looking what's in it than fishing it. That'll help you out the next year more than if you just floated to fished it. So if you can't find it online, I highly recommend, if you're going to fish the same piece of river over and over and over, taking a few weekends and hitting it with a seine and seeing what's there.
Awesome. Sean, you got anything else for Mr. Coomer?
No, I think that he pretty much covered everything I wanted to ask him. So.
Yeah. Well, Mr. Coomer, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for coming on here.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate it.
Do you have any sponsors that you'd like to shout out, or social media where people can find you and follow you, or anything like that?
I have a blog. It's Steven Outside, all one word, at blogspot.com. If you Google Steven Outside, it's the first thing. So you can follow me on there. I usually post, a couple 3 times a week during once fishing gets rolling, some fish pictures on there, and try to have some informative articles and things on there. I'm sponsored by Vic Coomer Lures and a custom rod maker up here that's called Little Miami Rods, and he makes rods one at a time for guys that if you want a rod and you want to handle this long and the guides this way, those are the 2 guys that pretty much sponsor me. I used to be sponsored by Pure Fish, and I don't know, it just, for me, they were a little too big, and as you can tell by talking to me, I'm kind of a niche. I do my thing, and that didn't work out as well for me, but those are the guys that I support, and that's my blog. If you want to check me out, you can also find me on Facebook. If you Steve Coomer on Facebook, you'll find 10,000 smallmouth pictures.
and they're most all of them big.
We try.
All right, well, thank you again for coming on.
Sure.
Any last words, Sean?
No, man, I think that's everything.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, guys. I
No
appreciate
problem.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Have a good night, Steve.
You too.
Thanks.
All right, everybody, we're going to close this out. Thanks for listening to another one. And Sean,
You want me to take us out?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right, guys. Well, thank you again for listening to the Bass Fish for News segment of the Paddle and Fin podcast. And as always, if you continue to get burned, come here to learn. Good night, guys.
Later, everybody.